Michael, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Corby.
So I titled this, What Hath the Food Movement Wrought? Because if there is a food movement, it has been brought to our attention, and no one more eloquent than Michael, who is the resident poet of the food world, of the food movement. And we have two great books that I hope you've read, In Defense of Food and Cooked. And I hope every single person here has read The Botany of Desire, which is one of the fundamental great books for anyone who wants to look at nonfiction and read nonfiction. And I love that book.
Thank you.
And I love Michael's writing. So we're going to talk about where the food movement is today, and then Michael isn't prepared for this, but our favorite topic, the elections and politics, which I mean, have you managed to have a couple of hours not thinking about them?
Yeah.
That was one of Ben and Donna's great gifts to us. But I will vitiate that, but not till we talk a bit about the food movement. So first I wanted to bring up social bifurcation. The idea that it is people like us who care about improving food, who care about the way food is raised, and the food system, and how much you see that changing, or whether, you know, when we started writing about food, the idea was, and I think remains, the elite leads, and then others will follow. So don't be worried about it if it's the elite conversation. Has it spread?
It's a good question. Thank you, Corby. I'm a great admirer of your writing as well. And you're one of the people I follow as I follow food. Yes and no. I mean, I think it still is a fairly elite conversation. It's a new conversation. I wouldn't date it to my books. I really would date it to the book of a mutual friend of ours, Eric Schlosser. I really think it begins in 2001 with Fast Food Nation, which was, in retro, and I teach that book, and it's an incredible book, because he was the first to really show us that it's all connected. That you know, the farm and the feedlot, to the corporate boardroom, to the waistlines of America, to the falling wages. I mean, he just showed us that food is part of a system that links a great many things in a powerful way. And that, for me, was an important part of my coming to consciousness about it. You know, but I am seeing, when I was working on the film for In Defense of Food, which was a public television film, we were obviously very concerned that it not be a very kind of affluent white cast of characters on the screen. And we were pleasantly surprised to find a lot of activism around food in the inner city. Popping up in the Bronx, popping up in Oakland, popping up in Milwaukee. Groups that had gotten very concerned about rates of diabetes and type 2 diabetes and obesity in their communities, and understood that food was killing their communities, and the lack of access to real food, and the fact that there was only convenience food on the corners. And this activism takes a lot of different forms. I mean, there are people working on gardens, community gardens, and farms in the inner city. There are people, you know, doing these amazing videos, music videos, and raps to call attention to the fact that one of the ways the man gets you is with Twinkies and things like that. And it's very interesting to watch, and we showed a lot of that in the film. So I see some signs of progress, and that especially as the health impacts of the food system affect communities, a political reaction to it. And so I'm encouraged by that. I mean, I think that many social movements, we've talked about this before, begin with elites who have the time and the resources to think about social problems in the abstract. And for many years, I mostly spoke to very slender audiences about, like this one, about...
you, of course, mean svelte and
svelte,
in beautiful
yeah.
trim, as
yeah.
we all are.
Yeah, rather than the people struggling with food problems that I wanted to talk to. And that's one of the reasons I've branched out from writing and do films and short books of food rules and posters and all sorts of other things, because I do want to reach as many people as possible.
And I have to stop and just ask about Twinkies. First of all, Twinkies barely exist. So
No, they're back. You know, somebody bought the brand.
I
and
remember they brought
yeah.
it back, but I thought it had died. So people actually still eat them?
I don't know. I don't know how the sales are of Twinkies.
But the fact is it can be a code word for the bad food that industry tries to pump into you.
Right. And make no mistake, there's a very, I mean, there is a war going on, and it's worldwide, between people resisting the onslaught of fast food in their communities, and with a real understanding of what's going on. Judith and I were in Brazil a couple years ago, and it was really interesting to watch how multinational companies like Nestle are working in very sophisticated ways to introduce the world's most impoverished people to the taste of Twinkies and sweetened yogurt and soda. Nestle has a barge that travels up the Amazon to introduce junk food to people who have never laid eyes on it. It's a supermarket barge.
And this was the subject of a FERN, Food Environmental Reporting Network, piece that ran in The Nation. They do very good investigative
Terrific piece about...
And they partner with different media outlets. I've worked with them from the Atlantic side, and this was a really terrific story. This
by Bridget Huber,
story.
Yeah.
And I think you've been involved.
Former student of mine, yeah.
That's right. So go out and read that piece. And it reminds us, our friend Marion Nessel, who's a writer everybody should be reading every day. She does
Food
blogs
Politics
almost every day at foodpolitics.com. One of her students, she borrowed slides from one of her students who did a thesis about children's teeth in South America. And one of the most horrifying and vivid pictures of it is of an 18-wheeler Pepsi truck in a tiny village in which it actually overwhelms. It takes up the entire street of the village. And there's like no better image of fast food and soda overwhelming something. So I was very glad to see.
And yet Pepsi presents itself now as the most progressive of companies on food issues.
And Nestle is doing really good and interesting and pioneering things. So
in
how
the
do we
first
live with
world.
that bifurcation? Because so much of it seems to be out of the big tobacco playbook.
Yes.
Of you know, sort of fighting, but progressively withdrawing in the United States, but pumping everything into Africa. But big tobacco wasn't particularly doing good things except funding modern dance.
They're doing more, yeah. And various, yeah, that's true. Well, that is the playbook. The playbook is, as you come under pressure in the first world, as the pesticide companies did, as the tobacco companies did, and now the soda companies and the junk food companies, you adjust there and make kind of, I think, fairly subtle changes. How consequential they are, we'll see, to reduce salt, to reduce sugar, to reformulate your products so they're much simpler. There's a lot of that going on right now, and it's to be encouraged. And but on the other side, these same companies, seeing their sales shrinking here, as soda sales are in free fall these days, they're pushing much harder in the developing world. That's where they see the future. So you see KFC is moving into Africa in a very big way.
And on a certain politician's private plane.
Oh, is that right? I didn't know about that.
You didn't see that picture?
No.
Oh, yeah,
Who?
with a knife and fork. But a barrel of KFC with a knife and fork, an ad for it.
So, but our government is encouraging this. The USAID is encouraging farmers in countries like Ghana to stop planting food for humans and start planting soybeans to feed chickens. So KFC can build an entire supply chain and fuck up their agriculture just the way they helped fuck up ours.
Where has consumer pressure gained traction? So we've talked about, and it's worth bringing up, and we did a session on it last year, GMOs. So GMOs and consumer awareness certainly had a big effect on industry and companies. And was it overall for the better?
Well, I think a certain kind of education goes on whenever you fight a political battle, and that politics is a terrific way to educate the public. So the soda tax fights that we've had all over the country have contributed, even though most of them have been lost. I think Philadelphia and Berkeley are the only ones where it's actually prevailed. many
But
losing
Philadelphia's
fights.
a huge victory, and
It's tremendous.
It's recent, and it's after a series of very depressing defeats in which Big Soda way overspent the activists, and they were just outgunned.
And did a very good job of splitting the African American community on these issues, and but yet consciousness increased, and that's one of the reasons that and they sort of suddenly people who hadn't really thought about soda in a serious way realized, wow, it's soda. There's something important here going on. There's a public health issue involved with soda, and soda sales declined as the industry fought it. GMOs, I think the education was a little faulty, and in part because the activists who did heroic work in their ways tended to rely on fear of GMOs, and I don't think that was the best strategy, although it's, as we see from, if you want to talk about the presidential campaign, fear is very effective politically. So, you know, my issue with GMOs is not a food safety issue. It's much more about the system that they help prop up.
Which is what I think everybody who is anti-GMO, if they realize it or don't realize it, what they're worried about is monocultures, much too much reliance on input and fertilizer.
And pesticide, herbicide in particular.
Yeah, herbicide in particular, and the toxic effects that's going to have.
But that's a complicated story to tell in a political debate. So for example, the most serious threat of GMOs in my view is it leads to the massive spraying of the herbicide glyphosate or Roundup in places and crops on which it had never been sprayed. And we've used so much, most GMOs, you hear about all these different products, but 80% of them are Roundup ready crops. And so this has led to this showering of our land with glyphosate, which we had thought was one of the more benign herbicides, but now there's a lot of research to suggest, and in fact the World Health Organization has declared it a carcinogen. And we're using so much now on our food crops that Monsanto had to go to the EPA and ask them to raise the permissible levels of glyphosate in your diet, which the EPA duly did.
And it gets worse because there's so much of it being used that there's now great resistance.
Well, it's not working anymore.
And so
so what do they do?
We go back to the much less benign chemicals, like what is it, D4T?
2,4-D and dicamba, and these, and you know, 2,4-D was one of the two ingredients in Agent Orange, and now it's coming back. And dicamba is also this dangerous herbicide because if the day gets warm, it floats up off the crops and creates a cloud and goes over to other crops that aren't resistant to it and kills them. So the whole thing has just been a botch. They're just not, I mean, it's not about GM per se, but the GM products we have are just really crummy products, and they're already outliving their usefulness to farmers who did use them.
It also gets complicated because the defenders of GM will say, but if you can have a successful drought-resistant crop in Africa that will feed more people,
or yellow rice, golden rice.
If you can fortify golden rice with vitamin D and prevent river blindness, why would anyone stand in the way of technology? And they're right, no one should. It's the system around it, and that is it too hard a story to tell? Why hasn't it been told?
Well, I don't know. I try to tell it, but it gets reduced to, you know, GM is evil. I mean, people come up to me all the time and said, you know, I'm convinced I have this disease because of eating genetically modified wheat. And I don't even get to the disease part. I say there is no genetically modified wheat in your diet. It hasn't been introduced. So there's a lot of paranoia and fear and loathing around it, which I think is unfortunate. And it has been pumped up by a lot of activists that I otherwise admire. And so I think that's been unfortunate. I also think it's consumed a huge amount of energy that might have been used to organize around other issues. And now, of course, the net result is big food, so-called, the large companies that make up the grocery manufacturers of America have successfully petitioned our government to end the GMO, the state initiatives to label GMOs. Vermont had passed its own initiative. Connecticut did too, although they're waiting for another state.
Connecticut had a 5 contiguous state rule before it would kick in, but food manufacturers were they were in a terror about having to conform to 48 different regulations or 50, and so they did everything they could to block Vermont. And it created the passage of an actual rule, but unfortunately it's going to be nearly invisible. It's going to be one of those product codes which you hold your cell phone up to, which is to say no one will ever see it, no one ever uses those, no one ever scans their...
and not only that, this law preempts any state from doing anything different. I thought that the Republicans were in favor of states' rights. I don't know what happened to them all of a sudden.
Oh, can you imagine? Can you imagine what happened to them? But let's talk about...
Oh, and the last thing about this horrible law is that if you fail to label your products, there are no penalties.
That's right. There's no compliance mechanism.
None whatsoever.
Mechanism about it.
So if you wonder, who has the edge in Congress on food issues, it's now clear as day. And Obama did sign this piece of legislation last week or 2 weeks ago.
And Debbie Stabenow, who was one of the great heroes, was very actively for it, the idea being that we're actually going to get labeling. We've won and we've prevailed over the Grocery Manufacturers Association, which didn't want it at all.
Right.
So there was kind of winning, but it might have been a Pyrrhic victory. But it wasn't something we necessarily care about for the reasons we've just discussed. But soda taxes we do, right? So let's talk about some positive movement.
Well, there are a lot of positive things happening. I mean, I think that we are moving toward taxing soda and sugar, and I don't know if it's going to work. There's some evidence that it does if you tax it high enough, as they did. Mexico has a soda tax. It's been successful. It's reduced soda consumption. Mexico has more type 2 diabetes than we do now, and a very high rate of obesity. And actually, the most radical reforms are coming out of South America and Central America right now. It's very interesting. Chile is doing very interesting things. Brazil, Ecuador, very aggressive labeling against junk food and taxation policies and nutritional guidelines that are far beyond anything we're doing.
And it's working. And I want to credit with Fern with a roundup, you should excuse the expression, article about the different South American campaigns. But I will happily find that link. I don't know if it was sponsored by the Food and Environment Reporting Network, but yes, it was good news. Yeah. And then India is right for this. So, soda taxes, sugar tax. Now I want to get into
labor. I mean, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers.
I'm not there yet.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I don't want to jump ahead.
Well, yes, indeed. That's absolutely first on the list of what I care about. But I want to get into organic, because that was a very early victory where rules were promulgated and there was actual meaning taken to something that had as little meaning as the word natural. So last time we spoke, you were saying organic rules need to be overhauled. And one of the first pieces that made me doubt my reflexive defense of organic was Michael's about enormous farms that adhered to the letter but not the spirit of the law. And we're using lots of practices about labor against labor that we would strenuously object to and want no part of if we knew that company was practicing it, but organic. So what should organic be now? What should organic 2.0 or 3.0 be?
Well, I really support organic. I think it's important it's important to criticize even things you support to make them better. But organic is the most reliable label we have so far, right? Mm-hmm. It's actually a federally defined set of procedures and growing methods, and it's enforced. And there's not that much fraud. There have been a couple isolated cases of fraud. So if you want a reliable label, ignore natural, ignore free range, you can ignore a lot of what you see in the supermarket. And organic has some force behind it. Nevertheless, the organic rules were essentially designed around 2000 based on a law that was passed in 1990. And they are a snapshot of what people concerned about food, health, and the environment were thinking about. And that was largely pesticide. The organic rules are really tough on what kinds of pesticides can be used. It bans most synthetic pesticides, the worst actors. And that's what environmentalism was, right? Going back to Silent Spring. But since then, of course, we have other environmental concerns as well, and concerns of social equity that are not addressed at all in the standards. So for example, the biggest environmental issue of our time is climate change. So how's organic on climate change? Well, it's not great. I mean, it's good in some ways in that you can't use nitrogen, ammonium nitrate fertilizer, which releases huge amounts of greenhouse gas. When it turns into nitrous oxide, it's as bad as methane, and it's a tremendous contributor to climate change. So that's really good. Some care of the soil, and soil is how we sequester carbon. I mean, it's very important. In the future, a lot of our efforts to combat climate change will involve figuring out clever ways to take a third of the carbon in the atmosphere right now was formerly in the soil, and it was released by agriculture. Believe it or not. I mean, agriculture starts climate change long before the Industrial Revolution.
And every UN report sounds that alarm. And
yes,
it's the food system. It's what we're eating every day that's doing
and meat production. Yeah,
meat production, which just doesn't seem intuitive. But
it doesn't. No, not compared to driving cars and heating houses and things like that. But there are certain things permitted in organic that are really bad for climate change. And the biggest problem, if you talk to an organic farmer, they'll tell you weed control is their big challenge. And that you don't have the tools of herbicides to control weeds. So what do? Well, they end up tilling the soil many more times than industrial farmers do, very often, to bring through the tilling for several times to kill all the young weeds, and then they plant. And then they hoe continually. And the problem with that is every time you till, you release a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. So if you were writing organic rules now, it seems to me you'd pay attention to that, and you'd pay attention to practices that sequester carbon and put them at the center of your rules. The other thing you would pay attention to, I would hope, is the lot of the farmers and the workers in the fields that are...
Which is what I most care about.
Which is, you know, the people picking these crops. And organic labor standards are no better than conventional, with this one exception. The workers are not exposed to really toxic clouds of pesticides.
A huge exception.
And it's not small. But when they were designing these organic rules in 2000, they actually talked about this. There were meetings of farmers and food producers who were organic, and somebody said, well, what are we going to do about social welfare and social justice issues? And there was a debate about it, and a farmer stood up, I don't know who it was, and said, you know, I can't afford health insurance for myself. How am I possibly going to have that for my workers, or retirement, or any of these things? And he spoke very eloquently and from the heart, and that was the end of the conversation.
I have to say, I just did a cover story for Boston Magazine about the chef shortage in Boston, but it really applies to restaurants all over the country, in urban areas especially. And the reason that too many restaurants are opening, and it's not just cooks, it's front and back of the house, and it's labor prices.
Yeah.
It's no one can afford to pay the rent. And owner after owner who, they've become my friends over the years, and they say, I'm all rah-rah for the $15 minimum wage, and then I think as a business owner, how am I going to pay this to my workers, and what am I going to do about insurance? So that is playing out again in the restaurant industry. I wonder though, organic and the word natural, what were the buzzwords when we were first starting to think about food and what should matter to buying it? And why wasn't labor part of it? It seemed part of the battles that have been won in the 60s with United Farm Workers.
That's right,
Cesar
Chavez, yeah. It was invisible to us, I think, and I think we didn't pay attention. We were so focused on the farmer and how the food was grown that we, and this is true throughout our society, we paid very little attention to the hands that actually do feed us. And
do bring up Coalition of Immokalee Workers.
So, and Eric Schlosser, once again, to tip our hat to him, had a lot to do with putting this right in the center of the food movement as a concern. And he did a lot of really good reporting on the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, who you probably haven't heard of, but they pick, if you eat winter tomatoes, these are the people who pick them in Florida, and they work under the most brutal conditions. Actual slavery until quite recently, and when I say quite recently, I mean 10, 15 years ago. people who are signed contracts come into this country and are indentured and cannot leave their
And they're
employ.
locked in trailers that don't have bathrooms. It's literal slavery, and there are gripping scenes of it in a book called Tomato Land
Yes.
by Barry Estabrook,
Barry Estabrook,
who
yeah.
took this up from Eric's initial reporting. And that's a book a lot about the Immokalee workers. It's a terrific book.
So here was this. So they started organizing. One of the workers and a young organizer, a young kid who just graduated from Brown. They tried to bring attention to this, and they had a campaign. They were trying to get a penny more per pound, which would change their lives. Actually, a penny more per pound for the tomatoes that McDonald's buys, that your Walmart buys, all these companies. And they got nowhere. They went to the growers, and the growers just like, if you won't do it, we'll find someone else who will. They did a hunger strike, got nowhere. They marched across Florida, they got nowhere. And then suddenly, so they used all the conventional tools of labor organizing. And then suddenly they hit on a new strategy. And as they put it, sorry, I'm forgetting their names right now. We found the door in the castle that was unlocked. And what that was the brands. That American corporations will do anything to defend their brands.
Are you all familiar with Yum brands? None of us is, but it's...
But it's every
sure.
brand you are familiar with is underneath that stupid brand name.
Yum, exclamation point.
It's KFC, it's Burger King. Oh, no, is it Burger King?
Yeah, I think it is.
It's
Taco Bell.
Taco Bell, yeah. It's a whole lot of the food brands. So what they did is they started organizing actions in front of these restaurants, McDonald's, Burger King. They had boycotts, and they scared the hell out of these companies that their brand was going to be associated with slavery in Florida, which was pretty powerful. And what they did was they didn't negotiate with these companies. They did something, I think, even more clever. They wrote what they called the Fair Food Agreement, and it was a pledge. And it said a penny more per pound for picking tomatoes, no slavery, I don't know how they put it, but and list of working conditions they were demanding. And they forced all these companies to sign the pledge that they would only buy from growers who had also signed the pledge. And they went through all the different companies, and they're down to, they've got most of them now. Wendy's is like the last holdout.
But now there's this funny phenomenon. I'm thinking of there's been such progress on so-called cage-free eggs and a lot of animal welfare rights that aren't, to my awareness, as straight a line from some picturesque ragamuffin, it's horrible to say, but some poster child for labor rights. Instead, the companies are responding to a perceived need to improve animal welfare rights. And so McDonald's, Walmart recently, companies you don't expect or expect to act only under intense embarrassment, pressure, as you have just described, seem to be doing this. What do we attribute it to? Is it bloggers we haven't seen? Why are they doing it?
Well, I think you're right that more progress, and this is I think this is just an astonishing fact, but more progress has been made on animal welfare in the food industry than human welfare in the food industry. Why is that? A couple reasons. I think we have more sympathy for animals, many people. I think that they're innocent, and it's very easy to feel warm and sentimental about animals.
Especially if they have big cow eyes.
Yeah.
That's literally an animal welfare trick of the trade.
Yes.
You only show big-eyed animals.
Which is to say the young animals.
Puppies and calves,
right,
which
right.
have disproportionately large eyes. That gets the donation.
But you're absolutely right. But the animal rights and welfare groups are also the best organized in the food movement. They've been around for a while. Remember, they were working on puppy mills, and they had all these other issues before the food movement had started. The Humane Society, under the leadership of a man named Wayne Pacelli, has done amazing jobs getting animal welfare measures on the ballot, pressuring companies, negotiating with companies. I mean, they're a model for what needs to be done across a number of issues. But there has been, and if we want to talk about the hopeful side, that is one of them. I mean, that there's a lot of movement away from the most brutal practices of industrial agriculture. And this has been led by some of the big companies. The upside of having a highly concentrated food system where a handful of companies, 4 companies slaughter most of the meat you eat, is that when you can get them to change, you can change the whole system overnight. And McDonald's succeeded in doing that in slaughter practices for cattle. And now we're seeing also the removal of antibiotics from animal production in a lot of places. So there are things to celebrate. And then there are these ironies, like why are we getting further with animals?
Well, what I'm thinking about is when you say McDonald's, I think of how really progressive they've been. They're trying to bring in salads. They're trying to do stuff, as with Pepsi and the big soda makers, because their sales are falling so fast. And when you did your documentary, were you looking at people like Daniel Patterson and Choi, I can't remember his first name, who are doing local, L-O-C-O apostrophe L, I'm not sure why the spelling, but they're trying to create well-priced alternatives to fast food. And this is where people who eat and have to rely on fast food can get them, which is to say Watts, East LA, and Oakland. Have you been to the local?
No, I haven't. I haven't been. It just opened.
And what do you think of that?
Which one did you go to?
Local.
And how was it? In
LA?
LA?
Started. And it tried to have more healthful, better sourced versions of what people actually eat. So the idea is, don't try to just shame them into not having Twinkies by Wrap or whatever the great activist efforts you were documenting were, but give them food that's very analogous to what they already eat, because it's what they're going to eat anyway. Make it affordable and try to make it better. It's very idealistic. It's where they think they can have an impact, and I'm not enough of a fast food maven to be able to say, was it actually, tasted fine to me, but I don't eat that kind of food.
Yeah, I haven't been yet. I mean, it's an interesting thing going on. There's a lot of, first of all, there's a huge amount of capital flowing into the food industry right now. It's really incredible. A lot of tech money, these funds that have been set up to develop sustainable food. Al Gore has one. All the big VCs now have a food department. This will only last 5 years. They'll all be out of food within 5 years, would be my prediction. The margins are just not good enough. If not sooner, yeah. But anyway, the result is a lot of innovation, and some of it's going to work. And one is this idea of, can we do a healthier form of fast food, or what is called fast casual restaurants? And there's Amy's is doing one. The frozen food company is doing one. There's one in Boston, Clover, which is a very interesting chain that does kind of.
Clover doesn't cater to poor people.
No, but it's college students. College students. But it's that kind of. But it's people who would, their alternatives would be less healthy, probably.
And it's food truck. And I realize I never should correct you on something with Cambridge, because you're now a Cambridge native. And you're now a Cambridge expert, so thank you for bringing up Clover.
Yeah.
We want the more, Michael just spent a year in Cambridge, and we want him back on a regular basis. So, yes, continue to promote Clover.
So, but yeah, I mean, bringing fast food into really underserved neighborhoods that's healthy and sustainable is something to encourage, and I hope it works. I mean, the early indications on local are not that encouraging. But, there's a lot of, the path from Daniel Patterson to inner city fast food is a very long path.
Daniel Patterson is, in fact, he's from Boston, and he's this gifted writer, beautifully spoken. He has extremely elite restaurants in San Francisco.
I mean, $150 price fixed kind of restaurants.
But he has
molecular gastronomy, the whole thing.
He has a big social impact focus. But meat, we were talking about meat and the environmental destruction. And VC. VC has most famously and conspicuously been giving tens and literally hundreds of millions to 2 companies, Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat. And I arranged and brokered the first ever taste-off between those 2 burgers at Aspen in July at the Ideas Festival. And I see some veterans. Did anyone taste both burgers here in this audience? We have Ann, who did. And which one? Do you remember? So sorry?
Impossible. Maybe.
Impossible has the better PR, and they had better sauces. So I prefer Beyond Meat because they're a scrappy company that doesn't have nearly as much money. But these are things you are going to see in your freezer case. So Beyond Meat has something called the Beast, which it has in the cool case next to the ground beef, which is really effective and a huge breakthrough, because before that it was just in the frozen food case. So if you get it right next to meat and try to make people think this is an alternative they could cook with. But you'll notice that so far it's only ground meat, because getting the texture right of anything bigger, the most they're going to be able to get is a chicken finger. You know, that's
right.
the best texture they're going to be able to get, and they are. But have you been following this? And
Yeah.
do you,
Oh, yeah. And I went to an early tasting of Impossible Meat, and it was
Impossible Foods.
Impossible Foods. It was not. It wasn't great. It was kind of livery tasting, and the texture wasn't.
Buzzkill.
Yeah. But it was in process. They hadn't introduced this product yet.
Well, I have to say, it's not that much better now. But they are so good at publicizing themselves.
Well, they have $300 million in investment capital.
It's also very high in fat. It's much higher in fat than the Beyond. I'm pal to the environmentalist, who's a great guy named Ethan Brown. The also irony is Ethan Brown, Los Angeles, Beyond Meat, and Patrick Brown, Stanford molecular biologist, who was
vegan.
He will let you know on the path to winning a Nobel Prize, but gave it up to save the world through because the most environmental, which is the same thing that Ethan Brown did. He was an environmentalist. The biggest impact you can make.
Yeah, and this was his passion. I mean, he's a very interesting guy. He's a brilliant scientist, and he thought. He's a vegan, and he did the research, and he said what's really going to destroy the world is beef consumption. And if you play out the trends going forward, even if you can solve the energy generation problem, meat eating is going to screw it all up, because beef contributes mightily to climate change at every level. I mean, it's the animals themselves with the methane they produce, but it's also the growing of the grain, and the fertilizer that goes on the fields to grow the grain, and the processing, and I mean, it's just, it may well be, for those of you who drive hybrid cars or electric cars, it's probably your biggest contributor to climate change now.
So you can either be a vegan, like the two founders of these companies we've just been talking about, who personally are vegans. One of them, the LA guy, said, okay, I need to taste this against supermarket ground beef, so thanks for giving me a taste, but I'm bringing my own ground beef. Which I did. They were good sports about it. And he will eat it and spit it. But the other guy, Patrick Brown, he's this great salesman, and he talked about how extremely close to meat it was. And I said, and when is the last time you had
meat?
burger?
That was my question for him. How are you going to know if it's any good?
42 years ago.
Yeah.
But labels.
It's like my sisters. I have two sisters who've been vegetarians since they were like 10. And when I come to their house for breakfast or brunch, they'll serve these fake bacons. And they'll say, doesn't this taste just like bacon? And I'll say, you have no idea. It tastes nothing like bacon.
So what are labels that we should be looking at now? And then, to end on a rousingly hopeful note, we're going to go into the election. But so labels like organic and natural. What makes the difference now? And what should drive some of our buying decisions?
People often ask me, so if I care about these issues, I care about the environment, I care about health, what should I eat? And it's not a straightforward answer, because it really depends on what you care most about. And some people care deeply about the welfare of animals, or they care deeply about their own health or the health of their families, and that argues for a different answer. So the wonderful thing now is, though, that whatever your priorities are and whatever your values are, you can find now in the market food that allows you to express those values or live by those values. So if your concern is primarily pesticides and the chemicals in the environment, or in your children's bodies, which I think is the time to really care about organic, when you have young kids or when you're nursing, organic is the obvious best choice. It does ensure slightly better animal welfare, not dramatically, but slightly better. But if you care about say you live in an area like this and you want to keep agriculture alive here because you like this landscape, or you like having farmers in your community, then you should be buying local even if it isn't organic. In general,
that makes me smile because that's my own personal value.
Really?
So I'm very glad to have you.
In general, the food that's sold, say, in your farmer's market here in Litchfield County, it may not be organic, but for all intents and purposes it is, because unless you're growing a giant monoculture, you know, all tomatoes or all carrots, you're not going to need a lot of pesticide. And you can't be servicing a farmer's market or a community like this growing one crop. So diversification is really what you're looking for, and that kind of takes care of a lot of pest problems in and of itself. So I tend to buy local when I'm in a place where there are good options. And I also don't, when I go to the farmer's market, I don't ask the farmers, are you organic? Because many of them are not technically, only because they don't want to deal with the paperwork, which is a huge and expensive headache.
It's a 3-year conversion process. It's expensive. Then the inspectors come every couple of years.
Yeah, it's a giant headache. And a lot of them are libertarians who really resent the presence of government in their business. And I respect that.
You unleashed a libertarian monster, I have to say. Whenever you say a libertarian, there's a very well-known
Well, some of my favorite farmers happen to be libertarians. And we don't agree about everything. But so the real question to ask a farmer that you're interested in having a relationship with, or buying food from at least, is how do you deal with pests? And they'll tell you. Or how do you deal with fertility? Very important question. It's the specifics, not the label necessarily, that you should be concerned about.
Well, as always, I completely value what Michael says, because independently, this is the advice this exact advice I give for people who are concerned about this. So the election, the reason I'm bringing it up is to review some of the progress that Michelle Obama made with the Let's Move campaign, which was to bring focus to childhood obesity and to the eating patterns that help promote that, and how to make a dent and how to change it. And whatever we can say about it, overall publicity mattered enormously. That this brought this into the radar screen of so many more people planting a garden at the White House. And whoever wins, we have
shopping at farmers markets early on too.
And starting a White House farmers market.
Yeah.
We have no guarantee that the next administration is going to hold those priorities dear. So what do you see as oncoming signals? Let's start with Hillary Clinton, for example.
Well, I would not expect Hillary Clinton to be as good on these issues as the Obamas were. And the Obamas were sympathetic to the critique of industrial food, even if they only acted on it in limited ways, and were thwarted by the industry at various times. There was an initial effort to reform the system. It didn't get very far. After the 2010 election. They kind of retreated. Nevertheless, Hillary Clinton comes from big food, to put it really bluntly. I mean, she was a board member at Walmart, you'll recall, and the Clintons' first political backers were Tyson, which is the biggest meat packer in the country, and not a good company. So when she was senator from New York, she did some good things for farmers upstate, and she understood the value of local agriculture. And it's a really good issue if you're a politician in New York, because it's one that unifies upstate and downstate. Cuomo is now discovering the same thing. And the fact that it was Michelle's issue, I don't see her making big moves. And from my own reporting, the kinds of people she's talking to about agriculture are not people I would describe as in the forefront of reform. She almost appointed Vilsack as her, the Secretary of Agriculture, as her VP.
Well, he really wanted it from what
he fought for it. He thought he was going to get it, and he may well be Chief of Staff. He's rumored for that. I think Vilsack has not been a progressive force on these issues, on balance. And the people in the Department of Agriculture who I'd be excited to see her appoint, like Kathleen Merrigan, who was Undersecretary or Deputy Secretary, the number two in the
USDA.
Yeah, that's not who Hillary's talking to. unfortunately.
So I have a very scary fact. You might have read the Politico report 3 days ago about the Agriculture Advisory
Yeah, there's a
Committee
Sterling group
that,
for Trump.
Now, here's what's really scary about it. They are people who know something about the subject they're supposed to know something about and have experience with it. And
It's a couple surprising names.
It's a who's who of foreign policy with 5 members of Congress, including the chairman of the House and Senate Agriculture Committees, 10 current and former farm state governors, 2 former GOP presidential nomination rivals, the governors Rick Perry and Jim Gilmore, 6 times larger than Mitt Romney's 2012 panel, and it's got people like the Texas Ag Commissioner who tried to bring deep fryers and sugary drinks back to schools, but they're not all clowns. They're actually serious people. So I thought, why is he bothering to appoint this so far in advance? And what could this mean? I don't have the answers. What were your thoughts when you read that?
I was mystified. I was mystified that he bothered. He has more ag advisors than he has foreign policy advisors.
Many more.
And they're more credible. I mean, they actually, you know, they're not people who served on Model UN, which was the credential for one of his foreign policy advisors.
My heart sank when I saw the credibility of these people, because I thought, but what I wondered was, why does he care about it? You know, why would he bother?
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that. It is mystifying. But I don't think we have to worry. I don't think he's going to be directing our agricultural policies in 6 months.
All right, you heard it here first. We have lonely 3 minutes for questions, and then good news about being able to assault Michael afterward. So
outside.
It's not in this room. It's outside. So first row, red sweater. Run, because we have so few. In fact, I'm going to do something I learned at Aspen, which is the most awful thing, which is we're going to ask 2 questions at once. So who had the next question? We'll hear the first row. Could you hand the gentleman, and so we'll do
K.
Slight grouping of
Actual
questions.
farmer.
But the lady first.
Okay. My question is, from what I understand, taxpayers help support the growing of corn and whatever in our farm industry. High fructose corn syrup is really cheap.
We wouldn't know about high fructose corn syrup were it not for Michael's books.
So is there, you might talk a little bit about that, but then is there some way to redirect the taxpayer support into more fresh fruits and vegetables, whatever, as opposed to corn, so that it would bring down the cost of healthier food and raise the cost of unhealthy food?
And I'm going to add an extra credit. Would you abolish subsidies to the big 5 if you could? Gentlemen?
I just want to make a point that the organic farmers put a lot of carbon into the soil, and if they don't, they're not really organic farmers. And so I don't question your... And then the other thing about meat, we should all be eating grass-fed meat, and why haven't you mentioned that?
Why haven't you mentioned it, Michael?
Well, the first grass-fed meat I ever ate was grown by Stephen when I was first writing about this issue. Very nice to see you. Yes, what a great idea. Why don't we subsidize healthy food rather than things like high fructose corn syrup? Wouldn't that make sense? Why don't we align our agricultural policies with our health objectives or even our environmental objectives? What a world that would be. Power. I mean, the answer is just sheer power. There is so much of big food, the industrial food companies that feed us most of the time are dependent on these commodity crops, corn and soy and wheat and rice and cotton to some extent. And so that's traditionally what we've subsidized. And we are, make no mistake, we are subsidizing junk food. And we're doing very little to encourage the growing of fresh fruits or even frozen fruits and vegetables. And that finally we're going to have to address this. It's very hard to address because the agricultural committees that write these rules are dominated by big farm state legislators. And the fact is that your legislators don't want to serve on these committees because not enough people make the connection between the Ag Committee and public health, or the Ag Committee and the environment. So urban legislators are not on these committees, and we treat it as a special interest. And I think that that's an enormous problem. I mean, the food movement will have come of age when it has allies on these committees, and we start having that conversation in earnest. Grass-fed beef is by far the superior alternative if you are interested in eating beef. And when it's done well, as Stephen does it, the cattle are rotated, grazed in a rotational way that in fact does sequester carbon and reverses exactly the kind of climate change issues I'm talking about. There is still the issue of the methane produced by the cows. And one of the knocks on grass-fed beef, if I may, is that the animals live longer and therefore have more time to exhale methane than industrial cows. No, it's a burp primarily. But nevertheless, when I eat meat, I exclusively eat grass-fed, grass-finished meat, and that is a label you should look for. Not just grass-fed, but grass-finished, because all cattle get some grass at some point in their lives.
All right,
so,
that is a
thank
useful
you.
label we could all take. And wonderfully useful conversation.
Thank you, Corby.
What fun.